Los Alamos, New Mexico, 1943. The desert was silent, untouched, and indifferent. Wind moved across empty mesas, carrying dust in thin spirals under a white sun that burned the ground without mercy. But inside a small, heavily guarded compound surrounded by barbed wire and military checkpoints, a different kind of heat was rising. The heat of minds racing faster than the world outside could understand. At the centre of it, all stood a thin man with sharp eyes, restless hands, and a mind that lived years ahead of everyone around him. His name was J. Robert Oppenheimer, and he had just stepped into a role that would reshape the fabric of the 20th century. Before the war, Oppenheimer was not a military figure. He wasn't an engineer or a general. He was a theoretical physicist, a quiet academic from Berkeley and Caltech who preferred chalk dust to command posts. He lived in equations, not in politics, but the world was changing. Europe was burning. Germany's scientific machine was accelerating. News of nuclear fission reached American laboratories, and with it came a fear deeper than any battlefield report. If Hitler's scientists mastered the atom first, no army could stop what would follow. In that moment, science ceased to be a study of the natural world. It became a weapon. Oppenheimer understood this before most. He read the early papers on uranium fission, absorbed every calculation, and saw the implications instantly. Splitting the atom wasn't a scientific curiosity, it was a doorway. Behind it lay a force more powerful than any explosive ever created, a force so immense it seemed to belong to the universe, not to humanity. Oppenheimer realized that if the United States didn't move quickly, another nation would, and that would decide the war. What made him unique wasn't only his intelligence, though he was one of the sharpest minds in American physics. It was his ability to connect disciplines, to bring together nuclear theory, quantum mechanics, engineering, metallurgy, chemistry, and military logistics into one coherent vision. He wasn't just a thinker, he was an organizer of ideas, a conductor of minds, a strategist in a war of knowledge. The US government saw this, and in 1942, General Leslie Groves made a decision that surprised even those inside the project. He chose Oppenheimer to lead the scientific direction of what would become the Manhattan Project. It was a controversial choice. Oppenheimer had never run a laboratory. He had never managed a large team. He had no military experience. He wasn't an engineer or an industrial scientist. Yet Groves believed something that almost no one else recognized. Oppenheimer wasn't being selected for what he had done. He was being selected for what he could create. When Oppenheimer arrived in the desert, he immediately began shaping Los Alamos into something the world had never seen. A scientific city dedicated to one goal: building a weapon based on the deepest laws of physics. He recruited minds from every field, from Nobel laureates to young mathematicians barely out of graduate school. He listened, synthesized, unified. He translated theoretical concepts into engineering challenges. He coordinated physics with metallurgy, chemistry with explosives, theory with construction. He built a bridge between science and war that had never existed before. Yet behind his calm demeanor, he carried a constant tension. He loved physics, the beauty of equations, the elegance of natural laws, but he also felt the weight of responsibility pressing onto every calculation performed in the lab. The race against Germany was real, and Oppenheimer understood the stakes. If the Axis powers succeeded first, the consequences would be irreversible. This fear drove him harder than military pressure ever could. The scientists worked day and night. The desert became a crucible of ideas. Equations filled blackboards faster than they could be erased. Workshops hammered prototypes at impossible speed. Test benches glowed with new metals and unfamiliar radiation. Even in the chaos, Oppenheimer maintained a rare clarity. He walked from building to building, discussing neutron cross-sections in one room, explosive lens geometries in the next, enrichment techniques after that. He became the intellectual axis of the project, the point around which hundreds of minds rotated. He didn't build the bomb alone. No single person could. But without Oppenheimer's ability to unify theory and practice, the machine behind the Manhattan Project would have collapsed under its own complexity. In Los Alamos, Oppenheimer became something he had never expected to be, a leader. And as the project accelerated, as deadlines tightened, and as scientists realized they were no longer exploring nature but shaping the future, a new question emerged. Not inside the labs, but inside Oppenheimer himself. It was a question that would follow him long after the war ended, long after the desert fell silent, long after the world saw the consequences of the work being done here. If you want more stories of forgotten engineers, hidden laboratories, and inventions that changed history, consider subscribing. It helps us bring these untold chapters to life. Was Oppenheimer guiding the project? Or was the project guiding him toward a future he could no longer control? Los Alamos grew fast, too fast for anyone to fully grasp what was happening. Within months, the once empty desert plateau transformed into a maze of laboratories, bunkhouses, power lines, and classified workshops. Trucks carried crates of equipment up dirt roads day and night. Soldiers guarded every gate. Scientists wore badges instead of academic robes. Every building hummed with tension. But in the center of this controlled chaos, Oppenheimer stood calm, shaping the most ambitious scientific enterprise ever attempted. His first challenge wasn't physics. It was organization. The Manhattan Project brought together the best minds of the era, but brilliance alone wasn't enough. Theoretical physicists argued with chemists. Metallurgists battled impossible timelines. Engineers confronted materials no one had ever tried to shape. Every discipline spoke its own language. Every problem depended on another problem waiting to be solved. Without structure, the project risked collapsing under its own complexity. Oppenheimer imposed order with a style that surprised even those who doubted him. He created specialized divisions, each with a clear mission: theoretical physics, experimental physics, ordnance, chemistry, metallurgy, hydrodynamics. He assigned leaders who were not only experts, but collaborative thinkers. He held regular meetings, listened more than he spoke, and synthesized dozens of perspectives into a single direction. Scientists later said that Oppenheimer had an ability no one else possessed. He could understand everyone's work, no matter the field, and connect it instantly to the larger goal. That larger goal was simple in theory, but overwhelming in practice: design a weapon powered by nuclear fission before anyone else did. To achieve this, Los Alamos had to solve problems that had never been solved before. The first was uranium enrichment. The raw material needed to sustain a chain reaction was scarce, and the physics required extreme purity. Oppenheimer coordinated closely with teams at Oak Ridge, where miles-long industrial plants separated uranium isotopes using electromagnetic fields, gaseous diffusion, and centrifuges. Technologies so demanding they consumed more electricity than entire American cities. But uranium wasn't the only path. The discovery that plutonium could also sustain a chain reaction forced Los Alamos to pursue two designs at once. That meant doubling the complexity. Two weapon concepts, two engineering routes, two unprecedented challenges. The gun-type weapon, later called Little Boy, seemed straightforward. Fire one piece of fissile material into another to create a supercritical mass. But the plutonium produced at Hanford was contaminated with isotopes that made the gun design impossible. The physicists realized this too late. Plutonium's properties introduced spontaneous fission that threatened premature detonation, a failure that would destroy the weapon before it assembled. That left the second design, the implosion device, and this became the project's most dangerous obstacle. Implosion required shaping conventional explosives into perfect geometric lenses, charges that didn't push outward but inward, compressing a plutonium core with uniform, near-symmetrical shockwaves. The slightest irregularity would make the device fail. A misaligned lens, a flawed detonator, A fraction of a microsecond error could render the entire weapon useless. The physicists understood the theory, but the engineers had to transform that theory into reality. Hydrodynamic tests began, using metal shells, high-speed cameras, and specialized gauges that measured pressure waves. Explosive experts worked in remote bunkers, surrounded by earth mounds and reinforced doors. Each failed test meant lost time. Each explosion carried risk. But the deeper the scientists went, the clearer the problem became. Shaping explosives with perfect precision was harder than anything they had attempted. Oppenheimer realized that the project needed something more than manpower. It needed inspiration. He invited younger physicists and mathematicians to approach the implosion problem with fresh eyes. Their work produced the now famous explosive lens concept, a structure that redirected shock waves like optical lenses bend light. Suddenly, the impossible seemed within reach. Meanwhile, Oppenheimer faced challenges that had nothing to do with physics. He had to balance personalities, brilliant minds with strong egos. He had to coordinate security without suffocating creativity. He had to motivate teams working under pressure so intense that mistakes felt catastrophic. And he had to maintain secrecy so absolute that scientists could not even tell their spouses what they were building. Some days the stress showed in his thinning frame, his restless pacing, his chain smoking. But every time he stepped into a meeting, he was composed, clear, and incisive. He became the intellectual and emotional anchor of Los Alamos, the person everyone turned to when doubts spread or challenges mounted. By late 1944, the pieces were aligning. Uranium enrichment accelerated. Hanford produced plutonium at industrial scale. Explosive lens designs improved. New diagnostic instruments emerged. Electrical detectors, high-speed oscilloscopes, pressure gauges built specifically for implosion research. The project reached a point where physics transitioned into engineering. Theoretical equations gave way to machining tolerances, detonator calibrations, and metallurgical purity standards. The scientists at Los Alamos were no longer exploring ideas. They were building a device that would reshape the world. But even as Oppenheimer pushed the project forward, he couldn't escape the moral weight of what he was orchestrating. He knew the weapon would change warfare forever. He knew it would kill on a scale no one had ever seen. And he knew the race against Germany. The reason the project began was almost over. But momentum had its own force. The machine of war kept accelerating, and Los Alamos was part of that machine now. As winter settled over the desert, Oppenheimer prepared his team for the next stage. The moment when theory, metallurgy, explosive design, and nuclear physics would converge in a single test. The fate of the project would depend on that test. And with each passing day, the desert horizon carried a new question. Were they building a weapon to end the war? Or a force that would reshape every war that followed? As 1945 approached, Los Alamos shifted from a laboratory of theories to a factory of controlled urgency. The air felt heavier, conversations shortened, deadlines tightened. Every calculation, every experiment, every assembly step pointed toward a single moment, the first full-scale test of an implosion device. For months, scientists had lived inside equations. Now they were building something that had to work on the first attempt. There would be no second chance. The site chosen for this defining moment lay far from Los Alamos, deep in the Jornada del Muerto desert. The Journey of the Dead Man. The name felt appropriate. A barren stretch of land with cracked earth, distant mountains and silence that pressed on the skin. Soldiers built observation bunkers. Engineers erected steel towers. Cables snaked across the sand. Instruments filled huts and dugouts. Everything was arranged for one purpose: measure, verify, observe. But long before the desert filled with equipment, the real work happened in the cramped buildings of Los Alamos. Physicists refined implosion models using hydrodynamic equations no textbook had ever contained. Engineers machined plutonium hemispheres with tolerances so fine they seemed impossible with 1940s technology. Chemists tested detonators, trying to achieve timing accuracy measured in microseconds. Explosive experts shaped lenses with odd geometries, concave, convex, layered, each designed to bend shockwaves toward the center like invisible hands. In these final months, the machine of the Manhattan Project reached peak intensity. Workshops operated without pause. Metallurgy labs glowed late into the night. Calculations circulated between theorists and engineers in endless loops. The smallest error could ruin the test. The slightest misalignment would waste months of work and delay the project in a war racing toward its conclusion. Oppenheimer walked these halls with an alertness that bordered on exhaustion. His posture was thin, almost fragile, but his presence was undeniable. He reviewed designs, clarified misunderstandings, mediated arguments, and absorbed pressure from every side: scientific, military, political. General Groves demanded results. Washington demanded urgency. Scientists demanded precision. Workers demanded clarity. The weight of expectation pressed into every conversation. The final device, codenamed the Gadget, represented the most complex object ever built under wartime conditions. It was not merely a bombshell, but a labyrinth of engineering. 32 explosive lenses arranged in perfect symmetry, a plutonium core nested at the center, firing circuits calibrated with unprecedented precision, and diagnostic sensors woven between components. Everything depended on compression, uniform, symmetrical, instantaneous. The physics was unforgiving. As assembly began at the test site, storms rolled across New Mexico, delaying work. The desert floor turned into mud. Winds tore at tents and shook scaffolding. Technicians waded through water carrying crates marked top secret. It was a surreal contrast, modern science wrestling with ancient terrain. Despite the conditions, the team pushed forward. They installed cables, aligned instrumentation, and mounted the Gadget onto its steel tower. The tower itself became a silent monument, rising above the desert like a warning of what was coming. Scientists slept little. Some barely slept at all. The final days felt suspended between anxiety and inevitability. At Los Alamos, tension reached its own peak. Calculations were checked again and again. Engineers reviewed timing circuits with trembling hands. Theoretical teams recalculated yield estimates, aware that any misjudgment could result in either a failed test or a blast larger than expected. Oppenheimer monitored everything, but he also understood something that others refused to say aloud. Once the test occurred, the world would change. Not just the war, the world itself. The boundary between science and destruction was about to disappear. As the team prepared to leave for the test, Oppenheimer gathered them for a final briefing. Not inspirational, not dramatic, simply a clear outline of responsibilities, timing, safety, and protocol. His voice was calm, but the room felt electric. Everyone knew that history was no longer a concept. It had a date, a location, and a countdown. The night before, the test was restless. Rain hammered the desert. Lightning flashed across the horizon. Scientists sat awake in bunkers, discussing possibilities in hushed tones. Would the device work? Would it fizzle? Would it detonate asymmetrically and scatter radioactive debris across the desert? Or, the most feared scenario, would the yield exceed predictions, breaking the tower, the instruments, and anything that stood too close? At 5,300 feet near the control bunker, Oppenheimer sat quietly with his notebook. He was surrounded by military officers and scientists, but he seemed alone. Years of work, thousands of minds, billions of dollars, and the future of the war itself converged into a single moment, waiting for a switch to be flipped. In those final minutes before dawn, the storm broke. The sky cleared enough to proceed. Technicians gave their final confirmations. Instruments came online. The desert held its breath. As the countdown began, the room fell silent. Seconds slipped away. The switch triggered. What followed would be remembered not only as a scientific breakthrough, but as a turning point in human history. An event that reshaped warfare, diplomacy, and the relationship between knowledge and power. In that blinding flash, humanity stepped into a world it could never step out of again. And as the shockwave rolled across the desert, Oppenheimer confronted a question that would define the rest of his life. A question the world is still struggling to answer today. If you want more documentaries about the whole hidden engineers, forgotten scientists, and secret machines that shaped our world, consider subscribing. It keeps these stories alive. Had they created a weapon to end the war, or opened a door that could never be closed again? When the sun rose over the New Mexico desert on July 16, 1945, the world was already different. Even if most people didn't yet know it. The Trinity test had succeeded. The first nuclear explosion in human history had torn through the darkness, leaving a glassy crater where sand once lay, and a shockwave that cracked windows miles away. But the most significant effect wasn't physical, it was psychological. The scientists, the soldiers, and Oppenheimer himself all understood instantly. This was no longer science. This was power, raw and absolute. News of the test travelled quickly to Washington, though the public remained unaware. Military leaders pushed for immediate operational deployment. Strategy shifted overnight. The Manhattan Project had been justified by the fear that Germany might reach nuclear capability first. But Germany had surrendered 2 months earlier. Now the target was Japan, and the pressure intensified. Oppenheimer returned to Los Alamos after the test, with an expression many colleagues described as drained, older, distant. He had spent years pushing the project towards success, but now that success weighed on him like gravity, he still oversaw final calculations. He still briefed officers and scientists. But a change had begun. Subtle at first, then unmistakable. Work moved rapidly. The little boy device required final arming procedures. The implosion device, Fat Man, demanded additional diagnostics. Teams prepared components for shipment to Tinian Island in the Pacific. The desert's scientific city turned back into a military staging ground. Oppenheimer reviewed the last sets of calculations, yield estimates, and assembly checklists. But as he walked the corridors of Los Alamos, he sensed the mood shift among the staff. Trinity had started as a test of theory, but ended as a test of conscience. Some scientists celebrated the breakthrough. Others felt unease. A few refused to continue. The cognitive line between physics and warfare had collapsed. In its place stood a device capable of rewriting geopolitics overnight. Oppenheimer understood their conflict because he lived it more intensely than anyone else. He had driven the project forward, unified its people, and made the decisive scientific calls. He had done so under the belief that the weapon was necessary to end the war. But now, with Germany defeated and Japan isolated, the original justification no longer carried the same clarity. Still, he pressed on. Because the momentum of war does not pause for ethical reflection. As July moved toward August, the United States prepared 2 operational nuclear bombs. Military planners debated the targets: Hiroshima, Kokura, Nagasaki, Niigata. The goal was to force surrender through shocks so overwhelming that Japan's leadership would have no alternative. Oppenheimer participated in the discussions indirectly, not choosing targets, but confirming yields, blast radii, and expected fireball behavior. He saw the numbers. He knew what would happen, but numbers were clean. Reality never would be. On August 6th, the Enola Gay dropped the uranium device over Hiroshima. The blast destroyed the city in seconds. 3 days later, Fat Man detonated over Nagasaki. The war was effectively over. For the world, victory had arrived. For Oppenheimer, something else had begun. A fracture inside himself that no equation could resolve. When he travelled to Washington after the bombings, he met with Secretary of War Henry Stimson and later with President Truman. Oppenheimer appeared thin and exhausted. He warned about the dangers of a nuclear arms race, the necessity of international control, and the moral burden now resting on the United States. Truman listened, but the political machine had already moved in another direction, one driven not by restraint, but by dominance. It was during this period that Oppenheimer made the statement that would define him in the public mind: "I feel I have blood on my hands." The line shocked Truman. It infuriated military officials. It fueled media narratives. But for Oppenheimer, it wasn't a performance. It was the honest acknowledgement of a man who had built a weapon he could not unbuild. As the Cold War emerged, Oppenheimer took a very different path from the one Washington expected. Instead of promoting further development, he advocated caution. Instead of supporting the hydrogen bomb program, he opposed it. Instead of embracing military alliances, he pushed for international oversight of nuclear weapons. This shift made him a threat, not to science, but to policy. The same government that had once relied on him now questioned his loyalty, his judgment, and even his past political associations. His critics painted him as a liability. The man who had once led the nation's most important scientific effort became a target of suspicion. By 1954, Oppenheimer was put on trial in a secret hearing that effectively dismantled his career. Accused of communist sympathies, undermining national security, and resisting weapons development, he was stripped of his clearance. His influence evaporated overnight. But what truly stood out was the irony. The United States turned on the man who had given it the most powerful weapon in history, because he dared to question how it should be used. In the years that followed, Oppenheimer withdrew from public life. He continued to lecture, write, and reflect, but he never again held the authority he once commanded. The weight he carried began at Trinity, but it deepened as he watched the world rush into the nuclear age he had helped create, an age he warned against, but could no longer shape. And in those later years, as nations stockpiled warheads and nuclear doctrine hardened into strategy, one question hovered over every debate. Had Oppenheimer saved the world from a longer war, or had he opened a future where war itself could end the world? In the years after the war, Robert Oppenheimer became a paradox. Admired, rejected, celebrated, feared. He had led the most ambitious scientific undertaking in American history, yet the country no longer knew what to do with him. The world entered the nuclear age carrying the imprint of his work, but Oppenheimer moved through this new era as a man caught between past achievement and future consequence. He returned to academic life, taking the directorship at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton. It was a place shaped by quiet thought, not military urgency. Einstein walked its halls. Philosophers debated under the trees. And mathematicians contemplated problems untouched by politics. For a time, Oppenheimer seemed to fit there. He lectured on quantum theory. He hosted seminars. He wrote essays that blended physics with reflections on human responsibility. Outsiders believed he had found peace. But the world did not slow down with him. Nuclear weapons multiplied. Strategies evolved. Nations redefined power through megatons. The balance of global conflict shifted permanently, and at the center of that shift lay a simple truth. The bomb was no longer a wartime anomaly. It had become a permanent fixture of geopolitical reality. Oppenheimer understood earlier than most that an unstoppable chain reaction had begun, not inside an atomic core, but between nations. Fear prompted build-up. Build-up prompted escalation. Escalation created doctrine. Doctrine created inevitability. A cycle powered not by science, but by suspicion. He warned that unchecked development would produce weapons so destructive that strategy itself would collapse under their weight. He argued for international oversight, transparency, limits. His speeches blended technical insight with philosophical concern. But Washington saw his warnings not as guidance, but as resistance. The hearings of 1954 left a scar that never fully healed. Although he kept his academic position, Oppenheimer became a figure living at the edge of national science. He was invited to conferences but excluded from influence. He was photographed at lectures but removed from policy decisions. His name remained iconic, but no longer authoritative. The man who had once shaped the outcome of a world war now watched quietly as others shaped the future he tried to prevent. Privately, he reflected often on Trinity. Those who knew him in later years described moments where he seemed distant, as though living simultaneously in the present and in the flash that lit the desert in 1945. He never publicly expressed regret for building the bomb, only for what followed. He believed the scientists had a responsibility not only to discover, but to guide. And he believed he had failed in that responsibility after the war. Yet the world continued to return to his story because it reflected something larger than one man's life. Oppenheimer embodied the tension between innovation and consequence, between knowledge and power, between what humanity could do and what it should do. Few figures in history stood closer to the line separating creation from destruction. By the 1960s, as nuclear stockpiles grew into the thousands and Cold War tensions sharpened, a strange shift occurred. The United States began to recognize the injustice of his public downfall. Scientific societies honored him. Universities invited him to speak. The government, years after stripping him of influence, awarded him the Enrico Fermi Award, a symbolic gesture acknowledging his contribution to the nation. It was not an apology, but it was something. Even late in life, Oppenheimer continued to explore the philosophical dimensions of science. He lectured on limits, the limits of prediction, the limits of control, the limits of human wisdom. He spoke about the fragility of civilization in an age defined by weapons capable of erasing it. His voice carried authority, not because of his titles, but because he had witnessed the consequences more directly than anyone else. When he died in 1967, newspapers around the world published headlines that captured the complexity of his legacy, the father of the atomic bomb. But the title was incomplete. He was also the architect of a scientific culture that fused theory with engineering, research with national policy, knowledge with responsibility. He demonstrated what brilliance could achieve, and what brilliance could unleash. Today, the legacy of Oppenheimer remains suspended between admiration and warning. Every nuclear treaty, every debate about deterrence, every discussion about scientific ethics carries echoes of Los Alamos. The world still lives in the reality he helped create, a reality shaped by intellect, ambition, urgency, and consequence. In the end, Oppenheimer's story forces a question that extends beyond war, beyond science, beyond history itself. It is a question about the relationship between human intelligence and human judgment, and whether knowledge alone can be trusted to guide the future. Was Oppenheimer a man who saved millions by ending a brutal war, or a man who introduced humanity to a danger it may never fully control?